Good day, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Last week, the UN officially blacklisted Hamas as a group that uses sexual violence in conflict, taking the long overdue step to acknowledge the horrors committed on October 7th and against hostages thereafter. Joining us today to unpack the recent developments and what comes next are Professor Ruth Halperin-Kadari and Attorney Colonel Reserve Sharon Zagagi-Pinchas, co-founders of the DINA Project. Moderating our conversation today is AJC Director of the Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, Kristen Broker. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Kristen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire. But for more than 50 years, AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute, or JBI, has carried out advocacy and supported efforts by our partners around the world to build an international legal framework that protects the rights of all. One of those partners is the DINA Project, a project of Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law in Israel, co-founded by a group of esteemed experts who, since the fall of 2023, have been working tirelessly to give Israeli victims and survivors of sexual violence the voice, the recognition, and the justice that they and all victims deserve. They've done this by carefully, methodically, and professionally mapping and analyzing the evidence and persuasively engaging international actors and governments to acknowledge Hamas's culpability for intentionally using sexual violence as a weapon of war. I'm so pleased to be in the company of two of the DINA Project's co-founders today. Professor Ruth Halperin-Kadari is founding director of the Rachman Center for the Advancement of the Status of Women at Bar-Ilan Faculty of Law in Israel, and attorney Sharon Zagagi-Pinchas, reserve colonel in the former chief military prosecutor of the IDF, and also a founder of the DINA Project, are with us today. The DINA Project's recent report was also co-authored by retired District Court Judge Nava Ben-Or, and the DINA Project team also includes Nurit Jacobs-Enan, creative and artistic director, and international journalist Ida Prince-Gibson. JBI applauded the DINA Project's launch in July of 2025 of their comprehensive book, A Quest for Justice, October 7 and Beyond. It recounts the voluminous evidence establishing that Hamas used sexual violence systematically on October 7 and against hostages thereafter, and it demonstrates that international law permits attribution of responsibility for sexual violence to entire groups that act with the intention and using the methods that Hamas employed on October 7th. Not only will the DINA Project's report help to ensure that those who rush to deny Hamas's use of sexual violence do not have the last word, but last week we saw the group achieve a monumental outcome as the UN Secretary General, for the first time, placed Hamas on a UN blacklist of parties to armed conflict that use sexual violence as a weapon of war. This achieved what few thought possible. The UN has now not only recognized that sexual violence was committed on and after October 7th, but it has attributed responsibility for its systematic use to Hamas. In the context of a UN system where anti-Israel outcomes are the norm, the success of the DINA Project's campaign for justice for Hamas's victims is all the more extraordinary. Now, both Sharon and Ruth, I would really appreciate if you could start off today by describing for us why persuading the UN to recognize Hamas's responsibility for sexual violence was such a challenge. Perhaps first, I'll ask Ruth, because you came to this effort with a better appreciation than most of the UN system's multifaceted nature, as you served for so many years as an independent UN expert on a body that monitored women's rights around the world, the CEDAW. Perhaps you can begin by helping us understand why the way that the UN typically goes about establishing actors' responsibility for committing sexual violence as a weapon of war and those methodological constraints made the task of blacklisting Hamas such a challenge.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Kristen, and thank you very much for the whole AJC team for having us on this call and giving us the opportunity to speak about our work and the recent milestone that was achieved, not just by us, but by all those who were really working hard to achieve this recognition by the UN. This is, as you indicated, this was our very first call or recommendation or expectation in the book that we published last month, A Quest for Justice, October 7 and beyond. Now, going back to almost 2 years ago, to the very first days following that horrific day of October 7, I found myself as former vice president of the CEDAW committee and somebody who's very familiar and known as and in the international human rights world as an independent expert, having a role or maybe even a mission, you can call it, for making the world realize and acknowledge and condemn Hamas for the crimes against humanity and for using sexual violence as a weapon of war. And it took me some time to realize that this mission is not going to be easy at all. Because if we aim to have the highest recognition by the highest body in the international arena, namely the UN, there is the Secretary General's annual report that covers everything that the UN was involved, that took place in the year prior to the issuance of the report, and there is a chapter about sexual violence in conflict, because of course, even as we speak, there are sexual assaults going on. We can just mention the most recent one, which the world still has to acknowledge and react and act, which is the attack against the Druze in Sweden. So the Secretary General receives information from his representative, his special representative for sexual violence in conflict, as Under Secretary General Pramila Patten, and she's actually in charge of that chapter every year. Her mandate is in charge of that. But she also receives the information to form her conclusions and to form her recommendations and to pass it on to the Secretary General. She receives information from UN bodies that are on the ground. So, for instance, in Darfur or in DRC or in Congo or in Ukraine, there are UN bodies that are on the ground that perform their own investigations according to UN methodology and framework, and it is called UN verifiable information. Validated information, and only that information gets into the report. So it doesn't matter, even if Israel conducts its own investigation, or even if civil society or other international organizations investigate what happened and come up with conclusions and with findings and with evidence, it cannot enter the report unless it goes through those UN channels. The problem is that there is no UN presence, no UN bodies on the ground in Israel for various reasons, including the very long-standing distrust and suspicion that Israel holds vis-a-vis the UN in general, justifiably or unjustifiably. We can talk about that later. But there are no such bodies in Israel, so there was no way to pass on any information unless we manage to persuade both the UN, the Secretary General, and Israeli authorities, decision makers, to have this UN representative allow her to come in and perform a fact-finding mission, which is unusual. She usually does not do their own investigations. As I said, she relies on information which is passed on by other UN investigative bodies. And to pass this threshold really took very intensive advocacy work, which the DINA Project played a very important role in. And Ms. Patton herself had to receive the authority from the Secretary General to come with a team of 10 people and spend several weeks here in Israel. And the report that they published in March of 2024 was really the first game changer. It was the first acknowledgement that there was reliable information about the sexual violence that took place on October 7, and clear and convincing evidence that there was, again, sexual violence still ongoing against the hostages in captivity. And as you pointed out in the beginning, it was still not attributed to Hamas. But we could, in our work, and we'll talk about that later, rely on those findings and continue with the additional information that was added throughout that time, through the more than a year that passed between the time that that fact-finding mission was performed to the year that we published our own report. But if our mission was right from the beginning to set the record straight and to have it acknowledged on the highest platform in the international arena, to do historical justice, that was the only way that this could be achieved. And if it weren't done that way, and it would not enter the Secretary General's report, that would mean that it didn't happen. For historical reasons, for the worldwide public opinion, for diplomacy, for decision makers, in terms of politics, it would mean that it didn't happen, and all the deniers would have their most potent weapon to continue denying, and we would lose that battle. So we were really very, if I could say, satisfied that that threshold could pass and we could continue our work.
Yeah, and it's so important to understand how it took a chain of events and that interaction between the DINA Project and the UN system over time to build up that confidence in those findings and lead to the outcome that you sought. Sharon, you have prosecuted many cases of sexual violence throughout your career, and I'm hoping you can help describe for us the other side of the challenge here, the substantive challenges that made the task of gathering sufficient evidence to establish Hamas's responsibility for sexual violence rather difficult, and how you went about making the legal and factual case.
First of all, I want to thank you for inviting us here. Thank all the AJC team, and thank you, Kristen. And I'll start by quoting retired judge Nava Ben-Or, which is our co-author of the book. And she always tells that she's a former judge and also a former prosecutor. And she always says, and I really sympathize with what she says, that she's been a prosecutor for many years, and I've also been a prosecutor for many years. And she thought that we understand everything about prosecuting sexual violence. And then when October 7 happened, we realized that we understand nothing, because sexual violence as a weapon of war is very different from everyday sexual violence. And I'm always apologizing when I'm speaking about our book and our findings about the wording. It's very difficult to find words because sexual violence, regular sexual violence, is also horrible. So what we realized that sexual violence as a weapon of war has many characteristics that are different from everyday sexual violence. And you have to understand the characteristics, and you have to understand the impact and how it influences legal responsibility and evidence. And I also say that sometimes, and sorry again for the wording, that sexual violence as a weapon of war is actually the perfect crime, because we see conflict-related sexual violence in many arenas around the world. It's not something new. It's not that it happened in Israel and it didn't happen in other arenas. And yet we see very few indictments and very few perpetrators that are accountable, found accountable for what happened. And this derives because of the fact that authorities in Israel and also globally tend to look at things, at crimes, the way they tend to look at regular crimes. And you have to understand that you have to shift the paradigm. You have to look at things differently. And I have to say, I always say it as a disclaimer, that we're not lowering the bar, not of evidence and not of legal responsibility, and we're not inventing new rules. We're relying on acceptable rules in the legal system in order to base the legal basis for accountability. And the first thing that we saw also on October 7 is the fact that on October 7th, many of the victims were killed, so they cannot testify regarding what happened. And also, those who survived are suffering very severe trauma, and therefore they are unable also to testify. So we find the phenomena of intensified silencing in conflict-related sexual violence. And if you try to rely only on the testimony of the victim or the survivor, then you can never find, can never prove, or can never get accountability for perpetrators. So we started to thinking, this is one of the major challenges. We started to try and find solutions. And one of the solutions that we found is a solution that is based on regular legal system and rules, that we have to look at things differently. Like if we are used to looking at things in certain glasses or spectacles, then we're changing the lens a little bit and looking at things differently. And we know that on October 7, and also in other arenas around the world, sexual violence as a weapon of war harms not only the individual, but also the community. And therefore, many of the crimes are perpetrated outdoors and not indoors, in plain sight, for witnesses to see, for the community to see, because the terror and the harm to the community is aimed to destroy the community. The crimes are aimed at the continuity of the community, and therefore many of the crimes are perpetrated outdoors, as opposite of everyday sexual violence that is perpetrated indoors. So there are many witnesses who saw sexual violence and heard sexual violence and heard victims of sexual violence in real time, and first responders. And all of these testimonies and evidence is evidence that is admissible and reliable. So what we're suggesting is just to shift the paradigm, not to change everything, just to shift the paradigm. And I think that by relying more on other testimonies rather than the testimony of the survivor or the victim, we're a little bit freeing the survivors from the pressure, because we saw after October 7, there was a lot of pressure regarding victims and survivors. Why are they testifying? Why don't you have testimonies of survivors? And I think that part of the problem is that survivors need to recuperate and not to be pressured to testify. And when we're using other frames of evidence, then it helps the survivors a little bit. So this is one of the challenges that we try to solve. The other challenge that we try to solve is the problem that in this mass attack, it's very difficult to prove a link between the perpetrator and the victim, because we know that on October 7, for example, the attack was a mass attack of hundreds and thousands of terrorists that came. They were all indoctrinized for genocide and dehumanization of the Israeli population. And one of the challenges that, and then you say, okay, so if we want to prove it, then we have to prove which terrorist did what to which victim. And it's impossible. It's impossible because these are the circumstances of conflict-related sexual violence. And what we offered is a way to get accountability. And the way is that to look at everyone that joined the attack willingly and knowingly that the attack is aimed at dehumanization and genocide, then by regular and acceptable rules of joint responsibility, everyone is responsible for everything that happened, for all the crimes that happened during this attack, including the sexual violence. And these are two solutions that we offer in order to prove the perpetration, the fact that those crimes were perpetrated, and also in order to use the evidence in the right way.
It's quite a challenge, and incredible that you were able to overcome it. Moving on to the blacklisting itself, Ruth, can you help us understand the significance of Hamas's inclusion in this list of parties in the Secretary General's report? What are the short-term implications, and is it significant for governments, for victims? And then what are the next steps that you are hoping it will lead international actors and governments to take?
So there's something a little misleading here. Sorry. And it's something, it's a claim that I'm also very familiar about. Well, what is it worth? It doesn't lead to anything. And the UN has no, like in Hebrew, we say has no teeth. And there are actually no legal consequences to this blacklisting. But it is an extremely, extremely significant step forward because it is the first time that an official international body, which is the highest actually authoritative body, shows Hamas for what they are, lifts the mask of them posing as resistance fighters, as freedom fighters, and calls them as the terrorists that they are, on par with ISIS and with Boko Haram, organizations that use the most vile and evil crime on the penal code, using sexual violence as a tool of war. Now, if we want to work with the UN, we know that UN still does not recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. And it will probably not recognize it for, I don't know how long, because that needs to be a decision by a designation by the Security Council, where Russia has the veto power, so it's never going to pass. However, blacklisting was entirely the prerogative of the Secretary General. He did not need the approval of the Security Council to go in that direction. So that is why this was really the only way that we could, in any way, move things forward and, as I said, call them for what they are and expose them as a terrorist organization that uses sexual violence as a weapon of war. And this has extremely important implications in terms of advocacy, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of being able to convince more countries to take steps, to take sanctions. There are other ways to do sanctions besides the UN Chapter 7 or whatever. The EU can take sanctions, which they already did, and we hope that this move will, again, take things forward to go and to put more sanctions, to go perhaps also after Hamas collaborators and organizations and even individuals and countries that allow them to work, that actually facilitate their whole financial infrastructure, there is enough evidence for that. And obviously, this can also influence many legal battles and cases and adjudications that are already going on in various countries on various aspects of October 7 and other terrorism that was used by Hamas. So the overall ramifications of this step, while not having a direct legal consequence, formal consequence, are very, very wide-reaching. And of course, in terms of the victims themselves, the recognition, the acknowledgement, this is an extremely significant way to give some sense of justice being done and some sense of accountability, even if not personal accountability of the perpetrators themselves, the recognition of the whole of this whole entity. You asked about the next steps. Again, like everything that we do, we divide it between the domestic and the framework in Israel itself, and then the international arena. Within the domestic framework, we are attempting to engage with prosecution in Israel so as to ensure that if and when charges are being pressed against Hamas terrorists who are being held by Israel, sexual violence is included in those charges, and indictments are going to include all those cases of sexual violence that occurred on October 7. We hope very much that we will be able to convince the prosecution in that direction. On the international level, as I already said, it is mostly advocacy work. And we also believe that our thesis, as Sharon delineated it, has implications which are much, much wider than October 7. We actually take October 7 as a test case, as a case study. All those challenges for doing justice, for the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, were very present in a very concentrated way on October 7. But we see them in almost every case. And that is, of course, the explanation for why there are so few convictions for sexual violence for CRSV in international courts. And we can also expand on that a little later, but in terms of next steps, this is a direction that we plan to go.
A lot of work to do, but it's fantastic that you have the opportunity to take this and make it even more meaningful than it already is. Let me move to another question about the DINA projects, the impact of your book. A Quest for Justice is a monumental achievement in its own right. It is, the Secretary General's report is a few paragraphs. Your book is the authoritative accounting of what happened on October 7th and after from a sexual violence perspective. Can you describe its impact and reception in Israel and around the world, and whether you're seeing it have an impact in combating this pernicious denial that has so concerned us since the hours after October 7th, separate and apart from the impact of the UN report? I guess this is first maybe Sharon and then Ruth, but your choice. Oh, you're muted, Sharon.
You're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. So I'll start. And then Ruth will continue. First of all, I have to say that because of the very sensitive climate and political climate around the world, we were very skeptical or afraid that the book will not make an impact and that it will turn into just get stuck in the campaign to silence and to close the ears to hear what happened on October 7th. And so we were, I wouldn't say surprised, but I think we didn't anticipated the wide impact and the wide waves that the book will create in Israel and also globally. From what we've monitored, just for example, in the first week after its launch, there were about thousands of articles regarding the book in major media outlets around the world, like CNN, like even in media outlets that are not always favorable for Israel, like BBC. And most of the publications were favorable.
Mhm.
And in Israel, of course, it made a great impact. I think maybe because it was a time where silence was so strong, it came into some certain void or vacuum that nobody was speaking about it. And it was the first time after a long, long time that somebody brought the subject again. And I think also that people saw that it was a report that it was a book that we really invested many hours in the research, thousands of hours in the research, in monitoring the information, and then trying to map the solution. And then I think for the first time, giving a roadmap of how to prosecute and how to look at the legal aspects of the phenomena that I think people don't want to talk about it and don't want to hear about it. And then I think we cracked the wall a little bit. Also, there were publications from influencers that published or tweeted the book. We know that the book was given to lots of leaders around the world. The book was also submitted to the Secretary General of the UN by us and by the State of Israel, and we're hoping that it had this effect. But also, sadly, but expected, we did encounter some bad reactions, of course, because we know that this is a long struggle, and I think it will not end here. Because talking and proving and giving ways to attribute the sexual violence to Hamas, and I just rewinding a little bit to before to say that one of the main points of our book was using the fact that we found sexual violence, widespread sexual violence in 6 areas with similar distinctive aspects. And it gives, legally, it proves that the acts of sexual violence were premeditated and committed with forethought. And I think this is something new that was not talked about before. And I think for all the people and all the groups that are fighting, they're struggling to silence us and to inject fake news and fake information. It was very important to say that there was no sexual violence, because sexual violence, people that commit sexual violence cannot be considered as freedom fighters. And this changes the equation. And I think this was one of the aims of our book. But on the other hand, of course, it encountered organization and people that were prone to say that our book didn't bring anything new. We also saw tweets from Rashida Tlaib, a congresswoman, that said that she retweeted a tweet that said that somebody read the book and it thought it didn't give anything new, and that we're lowering the bar of the evidence. So it means that whoever wrote it didn't read the report. So these were mostly the reactions, but I again, the word is not or pleased but it's a good sign that we see more positive reactions and widespread positive reactions, because it does show that the book has impact.
I think it's
Absolutely.
important to also to acknowledge that this was a product of very long research by independent scholars coming from a university, from an academic institution, the Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and not the government. We are not the government. We're not working for the government. And people were accepting this as a fact. And I think that this really has a very meaningful variable here. So it could not be just overlooked or ignored as some kind of propaganda or amateur exercise. And then perhaps also the time that that went on from the very first period after October 7 and the very extreme denialism attacks, it seems to me that maybe at least the international media was prepared to start accepting that the situation was more complex than they would have liked to put it in the first place, or more nuanced. And those freedom fighters may have not been that pure as they wanted to pose themselves. And perhaps even if Israel is or should be also held to account for things that it is doing on October 7 and also in relation to the hostages, the ongoing captivity, Israel is the victim and not the villain.
I think that's very important, and you've framed this in the way of saying what you're not, but I think another way of framing it is what you are, and what a difference that made on the reception of the report to the UN system, but also just the broader media and world. I mean, you use the word amateur to describe what you're not. Respected independent professionals with specialized expertise, the kind of commitment and reputation for integrity that comes through when you read the report, it's evident. And I think we've seen, at least from my perspective, a fundamentally different reception of this report than other perfectly well-intentioned publications, but this is hitting in a way that others haven't, and I think there's a reason for that, that you should be proud about, and I'm sure you are. And I had one question to follow up before we pass it to our audience questions. And Ruth, you had mentioned in earlier remarks other situations, as did you, Sharon, of sexual violence. That what happened on October 7th is not entirely unique, and that the DINA Project's work can help victims of sexual violence seek justice in other situations. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Are there other situations that you're engaged with? And what do you see the DINA Project's role in the future being to help victims around the world obtain justice and recognition?
I think we have to bear in mind that when we're talking about justice for victims of sexual violence in times of conflict, in times of war, there is a long, long history for that. And even though this is probably maybe the oldest crime known for humanity, it is as old as the history of war, which is sadly as old as the history of humanity itself. It was only in the late 20th century that the legal world had actually started acknowledging that this is a war crime and this could amount to crime against humanity. And it is not just a natural consequence of men fighting each other. which is the way that it was held throughout generations. Even if we look back after World War II, after the Holocaust, notwithstanding everything that we know historically about the Jewish women in concentration camps, and also the other side, German women being raped by the Red Army. It wasn't mentioned at all in the Nuremberg trials or in the Tokyo trials. Only with the special tribunals for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda did the international legal order start treating it as it should, and then the Rome Statute. But as we already said, there are hardly any convictions now by the ICC. And there's a reason for that, because the legal perception has actually changed from the special tribunals in the late 90s to the Rome Statute and the way that the ICC employs it now. And what we are aiming is, and we're not alone here. As Sharon said, we are not inventing the wheel. We are relying on acceptable theses, on acceptable legal criminal law theories, and we are showing how these can be used by changing the perception or by some sort of a paradigm shift, how they can be used so that perpetrators of sexual violence in times of conflict can be held accountable, even if it is not possible to identify the specific perpetrator and to connect a specific perpetrator to a specific victim, and even if there are no speaking survivors, as the case is as the case was on October 7. And the next steps and what we are aiming to is also to collaborate with others who are doing work in this area. And again, to translate how the legal theory can actually be translated into particular circumstances and particular cases, so as justice can be done in our case and in other cases as well. And there are so many organizations that are working in this field, which we have already started establishing some connections, and we aim to develop them further to also reach the ICC and see if we can move things forward in terms of the global criminal law theory, criminal international law theory in that respect. As I mentioned, in terms of what is still ongoing as we speak in Sweden, in Syria, we're working to raise awareness in public media, in international media. I think that what we are witnessing now is once again a failure of the world, of the international human rights world, a failure of states, and the silence that, and we of course also experienced denialism, but first came the silence, and the silence is happening again. And the hypocrisy and the double standard, the perception that maybe there are victims who are worthy victims, but then there are victims who are unworthy victims, or maybe it's not worth for us as the world to help these victims because we have other considerations, other political considerations, which I'm afraid is the case with respect to the Druze people. So we see it as our responsibility to act not just when it relates to our own people.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I think you have so much to share, and appreciate the challenge involved in overcoming that reluctance or the barriers to meaningful responses. Thank you so much to both of you. I'd like to pass it now to Claire for some of our audience questions.
Thanks, Kristen. Sharon, our first question is for you. The UN report does not blacklist Israel like it does Hamas, but the report does warn Israel that it may be included on the list in the future if it does not take further steps to investigate allegations. What legal measures can Israel take in order to address this warning?
I think the answer lays in the question, as they say, because the most important thing is that if there are allegations, that this allegation must be investigated or inquired in any way that is possible. And from my experience in the IDF, when I was chief military prosecutor, and over the years, every time there was a claim of any crime that was perpetrated by authorities, soldiers against the Palestinian population, and also if there were claims regarding sexual violence, then we used to put it into an inquiry or investigation in all of the mechanism in the army, and the army has very robust and solid mechanism of investigations. And I think that Israel must really take an effort also in the army, but also if there are claims, because from what I read in the report, some of the claims regarding to detention centers, and not all of them are held by the army. So I think if the army continues to use a policy of investigating any claim that he can get his hands on, and also that investigations like this must be done also outside of the army if there are claims against the staff in detention centers. I think that investigating these allegations, and we see most of the time at the times that there are no formal claims, just because there were cases that there were claims, and then the authorities, cases that I knew in the army, the authorities approached those people that complained, and they refused to file a claim, a formal claim. But nonetheless, even if there are no formal claims, I think that when there are indication of claims to sexual violence, I think they must be investigated thoroughly. And I think this is the mechanism that will shield Israel from, or help shield Israel from further allegations and for being included next year in the blacklist of the SG.
Maybe also we should add that we hope that Israel indeed continues to collaborate with the UN, with this specific mechanism of the special representative of sexual violence in conflict and her mandate. And this is also indicated in the report, in the annex, in what in that warning that Israel received from the SG. There is very clear way on what Israel's authorities and decision makers should take, and we hope that they indeed do that.
Thank you. Our last question before I turn it back to you, Kristen, is actually many people on the call are first thanking you both for your incredible work, and also are wondering how those of us on the call and AJC can better support your efforts.
Well, I think, first of all, we are grateful for all the support that we have already been receiving from AJC, from through the JBI, the Jacob Blaustein Institute, and also for hosting us. This is not the first time that we have been hosted by the AJC. And the HBI is a longtime supporter of the Rackman Center also, where the DINA Project is actually located. And this kind of support, obviously, is one that we constantly need. Things are not happening miraculously. The work that we are doing, at the beginning, it was all done voluntarily. We have been more well formalized or institutionalized, and we need resources. And as we expand, and as we didn't even mention the website that we are now launching it also in Arabic and in Hebrew, and in the near future in German. And this is an extremely important resource. And the support that we perhaps can receive for that is both in terms of, well, financial support, but also in terms of amplifying, in terms of sharing, in terms of passing it on as the resource for the issue of sexual violence in conflict, particularly on October 7. And I think I really want to add that if we look for rays of hope and perhaps silver lining during these 2 terrible years, still ongoing, sadly. It is the support, and it is the solidarity, and it is the connections, personal connections, and also organizational connections that we have established and that we still are establishing, both within the Jewish world and also outside the Jewish world. And so this question too is an example of these kinds of solidarity and support.
Just to add to what Ruth said, that I asked her to put our website domain in the chat. The website and also in the book, we're trying to create a language, a visionary language that help get the information more accessible to the public, because we know that conflict-related sexual violence is a subject that people do not want to hear about, as I said before. And we use a special vision, Norit Jacobs-Inon, which is our creative director, responsible for this vision, in order to help get the information more accessible. And I really invite you to get into our website and see all our resources and learn more about us, and of course about conflict-related sexual violence and what happened on October 7.
Excellent.
Thank you, Kristen.
All right. Well, thank you both for taking the time, especially at the very late hour that it is in Israel now, to join us today and to share more about your important work and your achievements with our audience. As Ruth mentioned, the Rachman Center has been a friend of JBI's for many, many years. And that's in part because we share that same fundamental conviction that the international legal standards for the protection and advancement of women, for combating sexual violence that we've built up over years, that those should be relevant to everyone. They should be protective for everyone. And the work that you've done has helped show in the most hostile of environments that that is still a possibility, and that this is still something worth fighting for and using to help victims of the most horrible crimes imaginable. Thank you so much for your work. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for your time.
Thank you both for sharing your expertise on today's AJC Advocacy Anywhere program. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in today. To stay up to date on the latest developments around this and AJC's global advocacy work, make sure to follow AJC on social media at AJC Global. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.